Potatoes are so ordinary now that it's easy to forget they were ever anything else. You mash them, roast them, fry them, and never think twice. But there was a time when almost nobody in Europe would touch one. A time when eating a potato could get you accused of witchcraft, blamed for disease, or lectured by a priest about the will of God. And there was a later time, in one small country, when the failure of this one plant killed 1 million people in the space of a few years. Tonight, you're going to follow the potato from a cold mountainside in South America, through royal gardens, through famine, and all the way to a space shuttle orbiting the Earth. It's a strange journey, but it's a true one, and it starts about 8,000 years ago, high above the clouds. Picture the Andes Mountains in what is now southern Peru and Bolivia. You're standing above 12,000 feet, where the air is thin and the wind never really stops. It's not a friendly place to grow anything. The soil is rocky. The nights are freezing even when the days are warm. And yet, scattered across this hard ground, wild potato plants were growing, small and knotted, some no bigger than a walnut. You would not have wanted to eat one raw. The wild potato is bitter, and it's genuinely dangerous. It contains natural toxins called solanine and tomatine, and eating enough of them can cause vomiting, cramps, and in bad cases, death. The people living in these mountains learned this the hard way, the way most early food knowledge was learned, by trial, by error, and sometimes by loss. But they didn't give up on the plant. Instead, over many generations, they worked out how to make it safe. They soaked the wild tubers in cold mountain streams for days, letting the running water pull some of the toxins out. Then they left them out through repeated cycles of freezing at night and thawing in the sun, which broke down more of the harmful compounds. It was slow, careful work, done without any concept of chemistry as we define it. And it worked. Then, generation after generation, farmers kept the mildest, least bitter tubers and replanted them over and over for thousands of years. They didn't have a word for genetics. They were doing genetics anyway, one careful choice at a time. Long before anyone in Europe had thought to ask why some plants tasted better than others. By the time the Inca Empire rose to power across western South America, sometime around the 1400s, this patient work had paid off. On the terraced mountainsides around Cusco, Inca farmers were growing more than 3,000 distinct varieties of potato. Some were bright yellow, some were deep purple or red, or a blue so dark it looked almost black. Some were smooth and round, others were gnarled and twisted in ways that would look strange to a modern shopper walking through a grocery store. Each variety had its own preferred altitude, its own soil, its own microclimate on the mountain. The Inca hadn't just found a useful plant. They had built an entire agricultural science around it. And through that science, they had built a civilization. And they solved a problem that would puzzle European farmers for centuries afterward. How do you store a fresh potato in a world with no refrigeration without it rotting? Their answer was a food called chuño, and it's worth sitting with for a moment because it's genuinely clever. Farmers would spread freshly picked potatoes out on flat, open ground at high altitude, and let them freeze solid overnight in the cold. Then, as the strong equatorial sun rose the next morning and started to warm the mountainside, families would walk barefoot over the thawing tubers, squeezing the moisture out with their feet. They repeated this freezing and stomping for several days in a row. What was left, by the end, was something light and chalky and almost weightless. A dried block of potato that could be kept for 5 years, 8 years, sometimes 10 or more, without spoiling. It might have been the first processed food in human history. It fed Inca armies on long campaigns through the mountains. It carried entire cities through years when the harvest failed. Potatoes mattered so much to daily life that the Inca measured short spans of time by how long it took to cook a pot of them, and measured distance by how much chuño a traveler would need to carry between two places. This wasn't just a crop to them. It was the foundation underneath one of the largest empires the Americas had ever seen. None of that meant much to the people who eventually carried the potato out into the wider world. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in South America in the 1530s, they weren't looking for vegetables. They were looking for gold and silver, and they found both in staggering amounts. The small, dirt-covered tuber that the people they were conquering ate at nearly every meal barely registered. Spanish soldiers and officials did bring a few potatoes back across the ocean to the Iberian Peninsula sometime around 1570, but there was no fanfare about it, no royal announcement, no celebration. Potatoes were handed out to sailors on long voyages as cheap food to help prevent scurvy, and given to hospitals and monasteries to feed the sick and the poor. The Spanish crown was busy counting Inca gold. A food eaten by people they looked down on wasn't something worth promoting. That decision, really, that lack of a decision, turned out to matter more than anyone at the time could have guessed. When the potato finally spread through the rest of Europe in the late 1500s and early 1600s, most people didn't greet it with curiosity. They greeted it with suspicion and, in some places, real fear. To understand why, you have to picture what Europeans already believed about food. Grain, wheat, barley, oats, rye grew up out of the earth, reaching toward the sun. Bread made from grain was thought of as a gift from God, and entire economies and social systems had been built around growing it. The potato did the opposite of everything grain was supposed to do. It grew underground, in the dark, in the dirt. It was lumpy and strange, covered in little growths people called eyes, and it belonged to the same plant family as deadly nightshade, one of the most poisonous plants in Europe. In a deeply religious and superstitious age, that wasn't seen as a coincidence. To many people, it looked like a warning. Rumors spread faster than the plant itself did. In parts of France, people blamed the potato for causing leprosy, and the Parliament of Besançon actually banned growing it in 1596 for exactly that reason. In Russia, the Orthodox Church called it the devil's apple and warned that eating it was a sin. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, people believed it caused everything from uncontrollable desire to a swelling disease of the neck, along with a general decline in moral character. In Scotland, some Presbyterian ministers refused to eat potatoes on the grounds that the word potato appeared nowhere in the Bible. So it couldn't have been intended by God as food for people. That's not an exaggeration added for effect. That argument was made seriously by real clergymen in real churches for close to 200 years after it arrived in Europe. The potato mostly sat in gardens as a curiosity rather than a meal. Wealthy people grew it for its flowers, which really were quite pretty, soft purple and white blossoms that showed up in botanical gardens in London, Seville, and Vienna alongside other exotic plants brought back from the New World. Marie Antoinette is said to have worn potato blossoms in her hair at French court events. Scholars wrote papers debating whether the plant was food, medicine, or poison, but actually eating it regularly as a meal that was seen as beneath a respectable European. Potatoes were considered animal feed at best, and at worst, a mark of real poverty. In England, even the poorest laborers could feel insulted if you offered them potatoes instead of bread. Bread was civilized. Potatoes were not. That was simply understood. For a while, it seemed like the potato might just stay there, stuck in the margins, growing in gardens while people across Europe went hungry all around it. It took war, and eventually famine, and a small number of stubborn people to change that. And that story of how the potato finally made its way onto European plates is where we'll pick things up next. The first real turning point for the potato happened in the Kingdom of Prussia, and it happened because of a king with a very practical problem. Frederick II, known to history as Frederick the Great, ruled Prussia from 1740 to 1786. His country kept getting pulled into brutal wars with its neighbors, and during those wars, invading armies had a simple, effective strategy for starving a population into submission. They burned the wheat fields. Grain sitting above ground, ripening in the sun, was easy to destroy. You just set it on fire and watched it go. A potato field was a different problem entirely. The food was hidden underground, out of sight, and an enemy soldier could march straight across a potato field without ever knowing there was dinner sitting 6 inches beneath his boots. Frederick understood the military value of that almost immediately. In 1756, he issued what became known as the Kartoffelbefehl, the potato order. He commanded Prussian peasants to plant potatoes and threatened that those who refused could have their ears and noses cut off. It's worth saying plainly, this was not a gentle suggestion, and it didn't work particularly well at first. Prussian farmers thought potatoes were disgusting, fit only for pigs. According to one often repeated account, villagers in the town of Kolberg sent word to the king that potatoes had no smell and no taste, and that not even the dogs would eat them. So Frederick tried something different. The story goes that he planted a royal potato garden on the outskirts of Berlin and put uniformed soldiers around it to guard it, day and night. He never explained why. He didn't need to. If the king himself thought these plants needed armed protection, people started to assume they must be worth something. Before long, local peasants were sneaking into the royal garden at night to steal seed potatoes for their own fields, which, according to the story, is exactly what Frederick had hoped would happen all along. Whether every detail of that tale is historically accurate is still debated among historians. But what isn't in dispute is the outcome. Within a single generation, the potato had become a major staple crop across Prussia and much of northern Germany. Meanwhile, across the border in France, a man named Antoine Augustin Parmentier was fighting a similar battle, though his path to it started very differently. Parmentier had served as a pharmacist in the French army during the Seven Years' War, and he'd been captured by Prussian forces and held as a prisoner for 3 years. During that captivity, the food his captors gave him, meal after meal, was potatoes. He didn't die. He didn't fall ill in any of the ways his countrymen assumed he would. In fact, he came out of the experience in better health than a lot of soldiers who'd been eating France's standard military rations. That stuck with him. It made him question everything his own country believed about this plant. Once he was back in France, Parmentier spent decades trying to change French minds about the potato, and he did it with a real sense of theater. He hosted elaborate dinner parties for Parisian high society, where every course, from the first plate to the last, was made from potatoes. He gave potato blossoms to King Louis XVI, who reportedly wore one tucked into his buttonhole around the palace. He convinced Marie Antoinette to wear them in her hair at court, turning the flower into something fashionable rather than strange. Then he borrowed a page directly from Frederick's playbook. Parmentier planted a large potato field on the sandy, poor-quality soil of the Sablons plain outside Paris, and posted armed guards around it during the day, then quietly pulled those guards away every night, so curious Parisians would sneak in and steal the plants for themselves. He was, in effect, running a one-man public relations campaign for a root vegetable, decades before anyone had a name for public relations. And slowly, it worked. By the late 1700s, France had begun to accept the potato as something people actually ate. France still remembers him for it. The dish hatches Parmentier, a French take on shepherd's pie, carries his name. So does a Paris metro station, a boulevard, a hospital. He spent much of his life on a vegetable most of his countrymen once considered unfit for a human table, and history gave his name back to it. While France and Prussia were coming around to the potato through royal gardens and clever showmanship, something very different was happening on the island of Ireland. And this is where the story turns from an odd footnote in food history into something much darker. Ireland in the 1700s was under British rule. Most of the land was owned by English and Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords, many of whom lived in England and never once set foot on the estates they controlled. A set of laws known as the penal laws had already restricted what Irish Catholics could inherit, what they could buy, which professions they could enter, and how much land they were allowed to rent. Families were pushed onto smaller and smaller plots, on rocky, boggy ground that wasn't suited to much. The potato turned out to be almost perfectly suited to this situation, even though nobody had designed it that way. 1 acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for an entire year. No grain crop came close to that kind of yield on so little land. Potatoes grew in poor soil where wheat would have failed. They grew well in Ireland's wet, cool climate, which made grain harvests unreliable. and they needed almost nothing to grow. No plow, no horse, no mill, just a spade, some seed potatoes, and rain, which Ireland has never lacked. A family could live on little more than potatoes and buttermilk, and that diet, as plain as it sounds, was actually reasonably complete. Potatoes provided carbohydrates, vitamin C, vitamin B6, potassium, and some protein. Buttermilk added calcium and fat. Together, it was enough to sustain a person year after year. And it did. Ireland's population grew from roughly 3 million people in 1700 to more than 8 million by 1840. And the potato is a large part of why that growth was possible. But there was a serious weakness hidden inside this dependency, one that anyone who understood farming might have seen coming if they'd been paying attention. Almost all of Ireland's potatoes came from a single variety, called the Irish lumber. Farmers didn't grow a range of different types the way Andean farmers once had. They grew one. That meant every potato field in every county across the country was, essentially, growing the same plant over and over. If a disease ever found a way to kill the Irish lumber, there was no different variety standing by to survive in its place. No backup, no plan. By the 1840s, the country's entire food supply rested on one genetic line of one crop, planted the same way, in the same soil, harvested at the same time, all across the island. The clock on that risk was already running. Ireland just had no way of knowing it yet. In the late summer of 1845, a cargo ship carrying potatoes from the Americas docked at a European port. Hidden inside those potatoes were microscopic spores of an organism called Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that thrives in cool, damp conditions. The kind of conditions that describe Ireland almost perfectly. The blight moved fast. It hit Belgium and the Netherlands first, destroying potato crops as it spread. Then it crossed into England, and then it reached Ireland. What happened next was almost impossible to prepare for because of how quickly it happened. Fields that looked green and healthy in the morning could be black and rotting by evening. Farmers would walk out to check on crops that had seemed fine the day before and find entire acres collapsed overnight into a stinking, blackened mess. When people dug into the ground hoping to save something, they often found the potatoes underneath had already turned to foul-smelling pulp. In parts of Western Ireland, counties like Mayo, Galway, and Clare, the smell of rotting potatoes became so overwhelming that people tied cloth over their noses and mouths just to breathe near the fields. That first year was devastating on its own. What turned it into something far worse was that the blight didn't stop. It came back in 1846, worse than the year before. It came back again in 1847, and again in 1848. Year after year, the crop that most of Ireland depended on for survival rotted in the ground before it could be harvested. Families with no other source of food began to die in their homes, on the roadsides, in the ditches beside the fields where their crops had failed. Diseases like typhus, cholera, and dysentery spread quickly through a population already weakened by hunger. Entire villages in the west of the country were emptied out. Workhouses built to to hold a few hundred people found themselves crammed with thousands, and mass graves grew behind them. Between 1845 and 1852, roughly 1 million Irish people died from starvation and the diseases that followed it. Another million left the country entirely, many of them on overcrowded, poorly supplied ships that came to be known as coffin ships, because so many passengers died during the crossing and were buried at sea. Ireland's population fell by roughly a quarter in less than a decade. Even now, close to 180 years later, Ireland's population still hasn't returned to what it was before the famine. It's worth pausing on how the British government responded, because the crisis wasn't only a natural disaster. While people were starving, Ireland continued to export grain, butter, and livestock to England, some of it under armed military escort to prevent it from being stopped or seized by hungry crowds. Relief programs that were offered came slowly, were badly underfunded, and often came with harsh conditions attached. Starving men were required to perform hard physical labor, building roads that led nowhere, in exchange for wages too small to buy the food they needed. Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official in charge of overseeing famine relief, described what was happening in Ireland as the judgment of God on what he called a morally inferior people, and argued that giving too much aid would make the Irish dependent on charity. He put those words in official government correspondence, not privately, but as part of how policy was being justified. The famine was a natural disaster, but it was made far worse by political indifference and choices that were made deliberately by people who had the power to choose differently. The consequences of all of this reached well beyond Ireland's shores. The people who fled the famine didn't simply vanish into new countries. They reshaped the places they landed in. Large numbers of Irish immigrants settled in cities across the eastern United States: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, where they were often met with discrimination, poverty, and open hostility toward their Catholic faith. And still, in those same cities, they built communities, labor movements, and political organizations that would go on to shape American public life for the next century and beyond. Others settled in Liverpool, Glasgow, Melbourne, and Toronto, carrying with them a deep, lasting anger toward the British government, an anger that helped fuel Irish nationalist movements for decades, and that eventually played a part in Irish independence in 1922. The Great Famine didn't just empty Ireland out. It scattered Irish communities, Irish culture, and Irish grievances across the English-speaking world. And traces of that scattering are still visible today in cities thousands of miles from where it began. Here's the part of this story that tends to surprise people. The famine didn't destroy the potato's reputation. If anything, it proved just how much the world had come to depend on it. The lesson that farmers and governments took from Ireland wasn't that potatoes were too risky to grow. It was that you should never stake an entire food supply on a single genetic variety. Grow more than one type. Breed for resistance. Keep options in reserve. In the decades that followed, plant breeders across Europe and the Americas began developing new potato varieties with resistance to Phytophthora infestans, and agricultural scientists set up seed potato programs specifically to protect genetic diversity going forward. The disaster that had nearly destroyed Ireland became, strangely, the starting point for a more careful, more scientific approach to growing this crop. Russia had its own long struggle with the potato, and it started well before the Irish famine and continued for decades after it. Catherine the Great tried to encourage potato farming back in the 1760s, ordering seeds sent out to provincial governors across the empire. Russian peasants resisted, sometimes fiercely. In the 1840s, forced potato planting campaigns triggered what historians now call the potato riots. Entire villages rising up against officials who were trying to make them grow the crop, burning fields and attacking the bureaucrats sent to enforce the planting orders. Eventually, though, the resistance broke down. By the 1850s and 1860s, a combination of government pressure, agricultural reform, and plain hunger pushed Russian peasants toward growing potatoes as a staple alongside bread. By the early 1900s, Russia had become one of the largest potato producers in the world, and in rural communities, people had given the crop an affectionate nickname, the second bread. In China, European traders and Christian missionaries had introduced the potato back in the 1600s, but for a long time it remained a minor curiosity, grown here and there without much significance. That changed when farmers in the mountainous interior provinces, Yunnan, Sichuan, Guizhou, discovered that potatoes could grow in altitudes and soils where rice paddies and wheat fields simply couldn't. The crop filled a gap nothing else could fill. By the middle of the 20th century, China had become the largest potato producer on Earth, and today the country grows more than 90 million metric tons of potatoes every year, more than any other nation. India followed a similar path. British colonial officials brought the potato to the subcontinent in the late 1700s, but it took decades to spread beyond small experimental plots. Once Indian farmers began growing it widely, production rose quickly, and today India is the second largest potato producer in the world, with the crop feeding hundreds of millions of people. It's woven so deeply into Indian cooking now that it's easy to forget the plant isn't native to the region at all. Across Africa, the potato arrived later than almost anywhere else, but it spread with real speed once it did. Countries in the East African highlands, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, began growing it widely during the 20th century and found that their cool highland climates suited the crop very well. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has called the potato one of the most valuable tools available for fighting hunger and malnutrition in the developing world. And a number of African nations have launched national programs specifically aimed at growing more of it and strengthening food security. Today, the potato is the fourth most important food crop on the planet, behind only wheat, rice, and corn. More than 300 million metric tons are grown every year across more than 150 countries. It's a long way from a bitter, toxic root clinging to a rocky mountainside above the clouds. And it's an even longer way from a plant that most of Europe once refused to eat at all. It's strange to think about, but the sheer scale of what the world now does with potatoes would have stunned an Inca farmer or a Prussian peasant sneaking into Frederick's royal garden at night. Take French fries. They likely originated in Belgium or France sometime in the late 1700s, and today they're a multi-billion-dollar global industry, arguably the most widely eaten cooked food on the planet. Americans alone eat roughly 50 pounds of frozen potato products per person per year, and most of that comes in the form of fries. McDonald's alone uses more than 3 billion pounds of potatoes annually just for its fries, sourced from farms across Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. Then there's the potato chip. Legend has it that it was invented in 1853 by a frustrated chef in Saratoga Springs, New York, who sliced potatoes paper thin and fried them until they were crisp, out of spite for a customer who kept sending his food back. Like a lot of origin stories, the details are hard to confirm with certainty. What isn't in doubt is what came after. The potato chip grew into its own enormous industry. The average American eats about 30 pounds of fresh potatoes a year, and another 17 pounds of potato chips on top of that. But food is really only part of the story. This next part tends to catch people off guard because it has nothing to do with eating at all. Potato starch is used in manufacturing paper, textiles, adhesives, and biodegradable plastics. Vodka, one of the most consumed spirits in the world, has traditionally been made from potatoes in Poland, Scandinavia, and Russia for centuries. During the Second World War, German industrial chemists worked out how to convert potato starch into synthetic rubber for military vehicle tires. After natural rubber supplies from Southeast Asia were cut off, potato derivatives show up in pharmaceuticals, in cosmetics, in animal feed, and even in the adhesive on the back of postage stamps. The plant that Europe once considered barely fit for pigs turned out to be holding parts of the modern industrial world together, quietly, in the background, without anyone thinking much about it. And in one particular way, the potato's story reaches somewhere no other vegetable has been. In 1995, the potato became the first vegetable ever grown in outer space. NASA and the University of Wisconsin successfully cultivated potato plants aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia as part of research into what long-duration space missions might eventually require. If humanity ever builds permanent settlements on the moon or Mars, agricultural scientists believe the potato will very likely be one of the first crops planted there. It grows in poor, mineral-heavy soil. It produces more calories per acre than any grain crop. It needs relatively little water compared to something like rice. It stores well under harsh conditions, and it provides a broad range of nutrients on its own. The same qualities that made it indispensable to farmers in the Andes 8,000 years ago are the same qualities that make it the leading candidate for feeding people on another planet. It's worth sitting with that for a moment before we close things out. A plant the Spanish barely noticed. A plant the French officially blamed for leprosy. A plant Russian peasants burned fields over rather than grow, and that Scottish clergyman refused to eat because it wasn't mentioned in the Bible. That same plant may be the first food humans ever grow on Mars. Think back to where this journey started. A small, bitter, faintly poisonous root growing wild above the clouds in the Andes. in ground too rocky and too cold for most other food to survive in. Nobody handed the people who first found it a reason to bother with it. It took generations of careful, patient work, soaking, freezing, thawing, selecting the mildest tubers again and again, to turn something dangerous into something that could feed a civilization. The Inca built an empire on top of that work, growing thousands of varieties, solving the problem of storage with nothing more than frost, sunlight, and bare feet. And then the people who carried the potato across an ocean barely looked at it twice. For nearly 200 years, it sat in European gardens as a curiosity, blamed for disease, tangled up in fear and superstition, considered unfit for a respectable table. It took a king threatening to cut off ears and noses, and a captured pharmacist who lived on nothing but potatoes for 3 years and came out healthier for it, to begin turning that fear around. It took clever theater, royal guards standing over a garden for no real reason. Guards pulled away each night so curious neighbors would steal what they'd been told not to touch. And then it took Ireland, a country pushed into depending on a single variety of a single crop, planted the same way across every county, with no backup and no way to know what was coming. When the blight arrived, it didn't just take a harvest. It took 1,000,000 lives, scattered another 1,000,000 people across the world, and reshaped the population of an entire nation in a way that still hasn't fully reversed, nearly 2 centuries later. And yet, the crop survived its own worst disaster. Not because people turned away from it, but because they finally understood how to grow it more carefully, more varieties, more resistance, less risk concentrated in one place. From there, it spread almost everywhere, into Russian fields, after riots and burned crops and a government that eventually won out, into the mountain provinces of China, where it grew where rice and wheat couldn't, into India, into the highlands of East Africa, into kitchens and factories and vodka distilleries, and, for a little while in 1995, into orbit around the Earth. It's a strange thing to sit with. A plant nobody wanted became one of the most important crops human beings have ever grown, not through some sudden discovery, but slowly through thousands of small decisions made by people who never could have imagined where it would end up. A Spanish sailor handed a sack of tubers as cheap food for a long voyage. A Prussian villager sneaking into a guarded garden at night. An Irish family surviving through a hard winter on nothing but potatoes and buttermilk. That's usually how the biggest changes in history happen. Quietly, unnoticed at first, carried forward by people who were only ever trying to get through the day in front of them. It's strange, when you think about it, that 2 of the most ordinary things sitting in a kitchen today, a bag of potatoes and a bowl of sugar, both carried this much history inside them. One was feared, banned, and blamed for disease before anyone would touch it. The other was treated the exact opposite way, locked behind apothecary counters next to opium, displayed as sculpture at royal banquets. At one wedding feast in the 1200s, a single household spent more on sugar than a knight earned in a year. You might assume something valued that highly would have a gentler story behind it than a root vegetable nobody wanted. It doesn't. If anything, What happened to get sugar onto ordinary tables is harder to sit with than anything you've heard tonight. Next time, we'll follow sugar from a wild grass chewed on the beaches of New Guinea all the way to the moment it became one of the most fought over substances on earth, and how a sweetness once worth more than gold ended up quietly rewriting diets, economies, and empires everywhere it went.